Walk another one a little bit, okay?
I'm going to see if I could, there we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Just Transition Subcommittee meeting, February 16th. Nice to see so many subcommittee members, as well as members of the public and other members of the Climate Council work. We have quorum, so we're going to get started a few minutes after 4. I know we have a few other subcommittee members who may join late, so Anna's going to join maybe 15 or 20 minutes late, and Sue had something come up where she won't be able to join us. I think those are the only 2 updates that I received from subcommittee members. So let's do just a quick review of the agenda. So we're going to do a review and acceptance of the meeting minutes. I'm going to review the agenda. We have hopefully the Biomass Task Group joining us, or at least some members from the Biomass Task Group, as well as the life cycle analysis contractor to visit with us about 2 different initiatives that are happening within the work of the Climate Council. So that's probably going to take a big chunk of our agenda for the first part of the evening. Our goal will be to break for public comment right around 5 o'clock. And then we really wanted to create space on this agenda as just open reflection and sharing space. I think Indra is willing to help kind of guide us in just an open space portion of the agenda. In the meeting reminder and materials, I did include some material that might be good fodder and appropriate content to bring up during that kind of reflection space on the agenda. And we can talk about that more when we get to a little after 5. And then for the last part of the agenda, we wanted to do kind of our traditional agenda item of update from the Climate Council, task groups, and other work groups. And something that we've put off a few months in a row now is to hear from Claire in a little bit greater detail about the public engagement plan that the Public Service Department or the Department of Public Service engaged kind of as a result of some of the learnings and insights from the Just Transition guiding principles. So want to make sure that we have a few minutes for Claire to go through that, and then have a conversation around some new co-chairs, and again, as part of some of the changes that are happening on the subcommittee. Anything else on the agenda that folks would like to discuss this evening? Okay. Acceptance of the meeting minutes from January 5th. Any comments or discussion items? We can take no comment as acceptance. Thanks, Marion, for putting so many of the documents in the chat for today's meeting, both our agenda and some of the other materials that were available. Jane, does it make sense and fair to turn it to you to help maybe do some introductions of the Biomass Task Group or the life cycle analysis efforts?
Sure, I'm happy to start and then turn it to Chase and others. So, Abby, just so I know how busy you are, and want to make sure everybody saw, but I did sort of clarify on the agenda. So the one that was originally sent around is different than the one that's posted, because I just wanted to draw out the distinction of the conversation with the Biomass Task Group from the request that will come after and communication about the life cycle analysis contractual work. So I just made them 2 separate things on the agenda and tried to make it a little bit clearer. So updated that online and had sent it to the co-chairs, but wasn't sure if it got circulated to everybody. So the link that Marion put in the chat is the current agenda as posted online. So I'll start with the biomass, and then we can do I'll happily do the life cycle analysis when our contractor joins, I think towards closer to 5, and make a detailed comment about the request around that.
Okay, so, and Jane, can I just interrupt for 1 quick second? So 2 things. 1, I didn't see that, so thanks for putting that in. I did not recirculate that updated agenda to the subcommittee. So folks will have to look to the chat that includes the link to the website that would have the most up-to-date agenda. And then we need someone to volunteer to take notes from the subcommittee. Anyone feeling so inspired today?
I'm happy to.
Thank you, Sebi. I appreciate that. Okay, sorry, Jane, I just wanted to cover those two pieces.
No, that's great. And at the last meeting, you all pioneered and put forward a recommendation around the role of this subcommittee in being a place where work that's moving forward, recommendations are being developed, would come to you to apply and have a conversation about the application of the equity scoring rubric, in addition to making sure that Just Transition subcommittee members are part of the process all along the way, to sort of being watching shop and thinking about the application of the guiding principles throughout the process. As you know, Chase has been that for all of you on the biomass task group, which is the task group that is formed that supports and carry forward original scope of work and recommendations that were birthed out of the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee, were originally tabled by the Climate Council for inclusion in the initial climate action plan due to lack of time for the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee to reach consensus, as well as voices from other subcommittees that had interest in those recommendations to be included before the council deliberated on them. So for the past 9 months or so, a task group comprised of Ag and Ecosystems, cross-sector mitigation, Just Transitions, and Science and Data have been meeting to, one, revisit the scope of the recommendations as originally envisioned by Ag and Eco, and then to advance and further refine those recommendations as a consensus document from the 4 subcommittees now participating. The council didn't take action on them prior to the end of the year because of a housekeeping issue, largely around 8 councilors expiring and the council not having what the council viewed as important representation around rural communities, around municipalities, and other seats filled on the council to effectively deliberate on those recommendations. So the council intends to take them up this spring. And it in a way was a opportunity for you all to test out in real time the process that will also go up to the council for you all to have the equity scoring rubric applied and discussed here first and foremost, and then for the task group to reconsider or want to reflect on what's learned through the application of the equity scoring rubric to revisit or revise the recommendations they were putting forward. So in a minute, I'll stop talking and let the task group members introduce themselves so you can see who's represented here from that group and what subcommittee they come from. And then Chase, who graciously leaned in to fill out the equity scoring rubric as a rough first draft, really on behalf of the task group not having capacity to come back together before this meeting. We know that it's a first cut at that equity scoring rubric, and I know Chase appreciates that too, and that the benefit of that document, it is a collaborative process. So hearing from you on that and having the chance for task group members to voice their concerns or interests and represent that in a updated document that would go ahead along to the council with the recommendations this spring. So that's sort of the background for where we're at and my understanding of the process today. And I'll let task group members introduce themselves, and then maybe if Chase is in a good place, hoping that Chase has capacity to sort of walk through his first reflections and then have a conversation about that. And Judy, you're right next to me on the screen. So maybe Judy, if you're willing, you could go first and introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Judy Dow. I'm the biomass task force, and I can talk.
Please turn your volume up.
It is turned up as high as it'll go, and I can barely hear any of you people either, so I'm not sure what it's all about.
Yeah, you normally sound really good. It's different than normally. You sound a little muted.
You sound very low too.
well, we'll go with it from there. Billy, I see you're on screen too, so why don't you go next as the task group member?
Sure. I'm Billy Coster. I'm with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, and I'm, along with Abby Course, the co-chair of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Climate Council. And I'll pass it to Adam.
Hi, everyone. Adam Sherman. I'm a member of the Biomass Task Group, and I am also a member of the Cross Mitigation Subcommittee.
Liz, I saw you come on screen.
Sure, just didn't want to jump in. It's Liz Miller, and I am a member of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee and also the Biomass Task Group. And I'm glad to be here today. Thanks.
And the final member I think I see that is here is Colin Smythe.
Thanks, Jane. I don't think I'm officially a member of the Biomass Task Group, but I'm co-chairing the Science and Data Subcommittee, and I'm very involved in the life cycle analysis. So, yeah, happy to be here with you all.
And has been attending the Biomass Task Group.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, and providing some technical support for that.
So I kind of see that our fearless leader who was driving back from Maine through the mountains of Western Maine today is no longer on the call. So I'm Abby or others, I'm sort of like happy to take the lead, but I will admit that I haven't reviewed Chase's equity scoring rubric in great detail, only at a glance. And so was really hoping Chase would be able to facilitate that part of the conversation.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that Chase will be able to join us again, but I wonder if it makes sense to just start with a quick review of the recommendations and see where we are in a few minutes from now, and if Chase happens to be in a space where he can join and review the equity assessment. And if not, yeah, it might be helpful, Jane. I think all of us have just had a brief review of it, and we can put it up on the screen and kind of go through it as best we're informed at this point. And really, it's just an example of like how you could use the framework to evaluate recommendations as at least a starting point.
Could you
We're
put
checking.
a link to his report in the chat, please?
You sound better now, Judy.
Yeah, I was
Yeah.
gonna say your sound's much better.
Thanks. I think I figured it out.
I was also going to ask, I didn't see a link to the actual draft biomass recommendations in our documents. If you could share that as well, so we have that to refer to, that'd be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Hold on. You're testing me. I just relocated from my office to home for kid care. So hold on. I have the equity open, but I don't have the recommendations open. So hold on a second.
Yeah, and I'll just say both were included in the materials for subcommittee members of the Just Transition. So that's in the agenda, an email that included all the materials for the meeting, but we can certainly put it here as well.
Oh, I don't think the email you
I don't
sent,
think the
Abby,
recommendations-
includes the original recommendations. So I'm trying to find those and can post them. It only included the assessment that.
They're linked in the report to the legislature. They're in the last council meetings agenda. So they're public
Yeah,
places.
I have the ability. I know where to find them. I just needed a minute to navigate to them. So just give me 1 second, please.
And I thought I had put them as a hyperlink in the agenda, but maybe not. That had been my intent. Yeah, so I have them. They're in the agenda, or they're in the resource materials, and I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, hold on. Let's. I'm good. I will share my screen now that I have it open. And
Jane or Marion, does one of you or someone from the biomass task group just want to confirm that the link that I just put in the chat is the proper one? So it's the draft from December 1st, 2022.
Yeah. I went to it I went to it a different way, but this link that I'm on is the one. Yes, it's December 1st draft. Yes.
Okay, so that's also in the chat.
So just to be clear, I was not prepared to lead this conversation largely because I'm not a member of the task group. I've been helping to facilitate this work and help organize it, but I'm more than happy to walk through these recommendations, but also would be more than happy to yield to a task group member, which is really the role that Chase was going to play. So just going to pause there and see if anybody else wants to do it. But if not, I will signal what these represent. So
I think it's just a lack of our having the ability to prepare, Jane. So I was here to listen and make sure that I could incorporate this into the work of the task group and then the Climate Council. So I'm reading them as we speak, having gotten the link, what is it, yesterday, I think? Maybe the night before.
I fully, and so apologize that this worked out this way with Chase having a challenge today and a newborn baby and a health thing. So totally understandable. So we will do our best right now. I want you all to see the recommendations that are up on the screen right now that I'm sharing are the ones that ultimately will go to the council. I believe that they may, as a task group, the task group will hear and reflect on the application of the equity scoring rubric today and comments around that, and as a group may decide to make any moderations to these based on what they hear. But this document represents quite a bit of work to get to this point, so it's hard to imagine how or what will come of it besides a reflection at the council level on the considerations that we hear from you all today. So these recommendations are largely associated with biomass, one, I should say, woody biomass. The inclusion of biofuels in this is not. Largely, the scope of this was pared down specifically from the work that the Ag and Ecosystems Task Subcommittee put forward. And specifically, it was really honed in on the application of woody biomass for electricity-led plants. And so the recommendations really hone in around whether or not a biomass for electricity is part of a climate solution. And really the bulk of agreement from the group started with the statement around electric-led new facilities are not part of a solution for climate strategies in Vermont. And then the bulk of the conversation continued to think about what to do with Riotgate and McNeil, our two operating biomass facilities, and how and where decisions would be made around phasing them out, and if and how and when. And that really gets at the specificity around the following recommendations, and then how to engage community members in and around the plants in that process. So,
Jane, being as this is my first
quick,
meeting of any part of this, and I am unsure of what committee membership I have here or in the biomass group, or all I know is I've been appointed to the Climate Council by the Speaker of the Vermont House. I asked for the appointment because of this very document. And I think that there is a whole lot of information that either hasn't been considered, or I completely misunderstand what I have been looking at and reading around this issue.
So David, I really appreciate your role now as a counselor, and appreciate that you're here today. But the chance for counselors to deliberate, there will be a chance for comment on this and a chance for public comment. But this conversation, we'd like to really restrict to the input around equity considerations and the role of the Just Transition Subcommittee in helping inform these recommendations as they go up to the Climate Council. So these are draft recommendations. There was a lot of work put in, and certainly as a counselor, you'll have a chance to opt to ask and request for more information once it gets up to the council level, but this is just one step in that process to get there to the council. So typically the subcommittee meetings are really a place for subcommittees to discuss, and counselors are always welcome to attend and offer input, but at different points along the way in the agenda. So.
Okay, well, I am just setting out that as you get to various parts of this document, I have comments.
Yep, thank you for that. And I suspect many counselors will have comments, and there will be a lot of refinement to this, and so appreciate that.
So Jane, can I just recommend a process that we just you go through the recommendations quickly. If there's any clarification that's needed on the recommendations, we can take that discussion then, and then we can move to the equity assessment and just save deliberations around what should change in the recommendations for the Climate Council meeting in March.
Yep.
Okay.
This is not a place to change the recommendation, so thank you for that, Abby. Yeah. Okay, so the first recommendation specifically is around new electric-led generation biomass facilities in the state of Vermont should not be used. The second one specifically talks about expansion of the two existing Brygate and McNeil facilities. And furthermore, the facilities should strive to actually use less biomass overall than they do currently. Specific number 3, the recommendation goes on to say that the state plan and prepare for the phase out of wood biomass electricity generation at both of the facilities. And in order to inform the phase out, that the state must advance an evidence-based study immediately to be completed quickly out of the Climate Action Office. And the language here that's highlighted in option 1 and option 2, the task group didn't reach agreement on it, and recognizing that the Climate Council itself and counselors are the ultimate deliberators on these, decided to forward 2 options around the language being investigation of when and how and if, depending on the study results, or investigation of when and how to phase out Vermont's 2 existing biomass electricity. So it's that, and if that was some task group members wanted. It goes on to
Just
talk
drop in real
about
quick to make a point, Jane. I'm sorry. I just want to flag for folks at the very top of this document. It says the task group consented or stood aside for the good of the group to let this document as a whole move forward to the council for consideration. So I just want to be very clear that not every member of the task group supports these recommendations. There's quite a bit of discussion and in some cases disagreement. So this is the best we could do as a group. We chose to move a broad suite of recommendations forward, acknowledging we did not have consensus around them for the council to consider. So that's the frame that these come from.
Then that language should be clarified.
Yeah, that's, I think, was the intent with that introductory statement.
Yep.
Thank you.
So there's all these other considerations that are specific to what should be included in a study. So thinking about the timeline for a phase out, thinking about the impacts on our greenhouse gas emissions by phasing out biomass and what it would be replaced with, the impacts around air quality, health, how to include traditional ecological knowledge in the study, adverse, again, public health, cultural resources, and then of course, impacts to Vermont forests around the application of biomass. I'm trying to move quick, knowing that there is a lot of detail in these recommendations, and really want to be able to shift our focus to talking about the application of the equity scoring rubric. And then, of course, as many people have probably heard, also considering the implications for the opportunity to have cogeneration at the McNeil plant, specifically for a thermal project. The climate, it specifically recommends that the Climate Council should further explore the role of heat from biomass. That was not a component of this task group's explicit scope. It came into the conversation quite often as they're very integrated, but specifically the expertise on the task group was not representative to really do a full analysis of thinking about the role of burning wood and keeping forests, the role on the rural economy, and more, and the negative impacts as well as the positive impacts. It's signaled to the life cycle analysis contract that we're actually going to introduce to you all shortly, and spoke to the work in that contract and specifically how we account for biogenic emissions in our inventory. It talked about engagement with the residents of Burlington's Old North End and Winooski, and how to do that in a way that brought in their voices to the process that didn't allow based on the timeline that we were operating on, and talks about the Just Transition Subcommittee in partnership with relevant subcommittees and task groups to advance that engagement work. And then finally, it talks specifically about the opportunities afforded to us as a state through the Inflation Reduction Act and more targeted air quality monitoring, and thinking about how to deploy those services in partnership with DEC, who regulates that, as well as the Department of Health, to really better and more acutely assess the public health impacts from burning biomass. Any questions? I know that that is does not do service to the numerous scientific presenters we had come in, the rigorous debate, and the fact that existing tensions still lie even amongst the task group members themselves on the recommendations. But with the experts in the room, happy to hear any questions specifically on the recommendations before we shift to the equity impact assessment.
I had asked early on after I was appointed if I could see the scientific documentation that position paper is based on. And I wanted a listing of expert witnesses that you've now referenced in your presentation that paper is based on. I've been doing my own research, and I just want to make sure that in fact things like a memo from the health department that I reviewed about the impacts of those plants was part of the discussion or part of the base on that underwrites what's in that document. And so what I want to be able to do is to say, oh, okay, so I've read what they read. Maybe I just do a different conclusion. But then again, maybe they haven't read what I've read, or they've read stuff different. So I make that request again. I want to see, in whatever time frame is possible, to take a look at the underpinnings of that recommendation.
Thanks, David. And I will promise to continue to work with you to make sure you can see the speakers we had come in and the papers that we referenced. And we'll do that with you in advance of the council conversation on this. I do see that
Jane, I'm sorry. It would be worth pointing out to the group that all of those recordings are also available online. So one thing that could be done is, it would take some time because there were several meetings, no doubt, but all of the meeting materials as well as the recordings themselves, I believe, are still available. Yeah.
Yep. Everything's online.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And also
Yeah,
the PowerPoints that the scientists presented you would be able to see them on the videos as well.
Thank you, Judy. Yeah, so at climatechange.vermont.gov, and this goes for anybody who's interested in understanding the work that was done to put forward these recommendations, on our calendar website, that you'll see going back the last 9 months biomass task group meetings, and all the meetings were recorded, and all of the meetings and presentations and materials that support those meetings are posted publicly. So they're all there. I was really excited because I saw Chase, and I was feeling like Chase was coming in to take us through the equity scoring rubric, but he's gone. And so ask all of you if you would like me to share my screen and walk through it, or I will note also that our contractor is on the call, and if you would like, we could shift to life cycle analysis and come back to the equity scoring rubric, but really defer to you all how best you want to facilitate this, just knowing that I was not prepared to do that.
So I can just share what I know about Chase's travel, sorry, so that he knows that he's traveling through kind of like a mountainous area where he may have service for a time, and he may lose it, he may get it back again. So we may have success in having Chase kind of walk us through the document, and here he comes again. Chase, how are you doing in your travels so far?
In and out of service, and
Yeah.
a very sad baby. Sorry, I'm not able to be more present.
That's okay. Chase, I'm just going to ask you a question and see if you have a preference. And if your answer is just, we can't ask you to play a role this evening, that's totally understandable. We're at the place in the agenda where we could hear your review of the equity rubric and the kind of the thinking and the process that you went through. At this time, we've just reviewed the recommendations from the biomass task group, or we could take a pause, switch to the life cycle analysis contractor, and try to come back to you if you have the sense that you might have better service. Or again, Jane has offered to do her best to run through it, having not spent a lot of time reviewing the equity assessment. Just wanted to see if you have a sense or a preference at this point.
I mean, I could give a very high level overview now, and if you lose me, then I'll hopefully be back in a service area soon. So since I have a little service now, I'll just quickly jump in and say that the equity assessment is really a draft. It's very preliminary. The hope is that others will weigh in, and that this is just the very first step in what will be a conversation that includes more voices and more perspectives, especially those from the biomass task group, from the Just Transition Subcommittee, and ideally also impacted community members whose voices have not been heard really to this point, or many of them are not. At a high level, the equity assessment tried to look at the biomass task group's recommendations, and it tried to differentiate between recommendations that would take effect today versus those that call for studies that would look into questions that would be answered later in the future. And it also tried to draw a distinction between community members who live nearby to facilities and would be exposed to the emissions from those facilities. And then also Vermonters, such as private landowners, foresters, and other people whose livelihoods are currently bound up with those facilities in terms of selling wood to them. And for that segment of folks, thinking through a just transition for them to help identify different revenue streams and markets, so that if at some point in the future those facilities were to phase down, those impacted people would have alternative means to make a living and have a livelihood, and in that way facilitated just transition for those people. And so those were the kind of distinctions that I had in my mind when I went through. I'm probably, I'm a tough grader. And so if some people think that I gave scores that were too low, I'm very open to hearing that feedback. And two, also just know that I don't have pride of authorship over this at all. And really do look forward to hearing from others, working with others, and also just having others jump in and do some of the work themselves. So that's a high level overview. Hopefully I still have service and you all heard that.
Yeah, we hear you great, Chase. Yeah, and we're doing just a screen share of your preliminary equity assessment. I'm happy to go through different sections or take questions. Yeah, Liz, I see your hand raised and then Kelly's.
Yeah, thank you. So sorry if this was already mentioned, but I guess I'm still trying to understand what the just transition plan is for loggers, any workers as well at these facilities.
So as far as those types of plans, I guess I would just say that looking at the recommendations themselves, the biomass task group's recommendations would be a good place, since this document is more or less a reflection upon those recommendations. And in the recommendations, there's a call for a study that would be overseen by the Climate Action Office, but it would be done by independent third party, be evidence-based. And one of the things that study would be charged with investigating would be identifying alternative revenue streams and also potential alternative markets for Vermont landowners and for other folks who are bound up in the forestry industry to help them in the event that there ever were a phase down in Vermont's biomass facilities, for them to be able to find different markets. So one such market that often gets talked about is wood fiber insulation. Another is like wood-based particle boards.
I can jump in and just say
Thanks,
that
Billy.
there is no plan currently. I think the intent of the recommendations is there's an acknowledgement that there would be an impact on those communities if that action occurred, and that there needs to be a plan for a transition for them.
Thanks, Billy. Kelly, and then Liz Miller.
Thanks. Just a quick question for data, and I figure someone from the biomass task group might know this. How many people are employed by these two different plants?
We received that information. I don't know that any of us have it on the top of our
Yeah. We did get that information, but I seem to recall like 42 people at McNeil and less at Rygate. But the concern was not just the employees, the concern was loggers. And that's why we wanted a report done, like how is it going to impact these people? Are they going to be able to find work other places? And so it kind of like had tentacles out into the community.
Yeah, thank you. I was wanting that just for context, because I really had no sense if it was hundreds, tens, and so it sounds like it's tens. And
Yeah.
the number of people who live nearby within a 1 mile radius of McNeil is many, many, many more than that. So there's that consideration.
Right. I can't remember the guy's name, but there's somebody on the committee. He added a component to the bottom of our recommendations that it's difficult if it's to determine who it impacts if there's less than 100 people. So myself and him worked together to calculate. We drew a circle and we did the population. Within a 1 mile circle, there was a little more than 4,500 people living there.
I just want to jump in quickly and say this, it gets very complicated very quickly, Kelly, because there's the direct people who are employed by the plants. Then there's this whole radius of 50 to 90 miles of woodsheds around each of them, where there's many private landowners, loggers, foresters, people engaged in the forest products industry that rely on this as a market for their materials. And there was some question about whether if these plants were to close, that could unravel in a way that would have a pretty profound effect on a pretty significant radius of Vermonters.
It's almost like we're all connected somehow. We all rely on each other like an ecosystem.
Yeah, I can't figure out on how to raise my hand, but I would like to join.
Thanks, David. I'll keep you in the queue. So I'm going to go to Liz Miller and then we can go to David.
Great, thank you. I really appreciate it. I just wanted, knowing that Chase's coverage is tough, and for what support it's worth, I did have a chance to look through what he did, and we haven't, as a task group, been able to talk about it. But I just want to lend my support to what he did. I do think that using the matrix and the rubric, the scoring rubric, in this way, even for a task group that largely recommends further study and further looking at things, right, is both a good exercise because it keeps us on our toes and focused on what we should be focused on, as well as recognizes that the answers in large part will be developed through those further studies that are recommended. And so while, as he noted, he might be a tough grader, there might be some 1.5s that I, arm wrestle him for a 2 or something. I do think he took a fair approach given the set of recommendations we came up with, which, as Billy noted, weren't unanimous consensus among the task group, but we did have many meetings together and I think worked productively for the set of recommendations that we did have and will be presenting to the council. So I just wanted to add that context from another task group member's point of view. To me, what we were tasked with may not fit the type of direct action that would be most useful for going through this rubric, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. And I think Chase took the right approach in noting wherever he did the 1s or the 1.5s for the reasons that he's mentioned. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz. So I just want to note the time. So David, I'm happy to take a relatively brief comment now, and then it's 4:45. So we want to take public comment as scheduled on the agenda, even though we're still only partway through the reactions to the equity assessment, but happy to hear your comments.
The impact on the wood industry as a whole can't be measured in discrete miles or numbers of people. The industry is like a hydraulic system. If you put pressure on it in one place, the entire system feels it. So I'm really going to be interested in the economic analysis that was done on this.
Thank you, David. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing for a moment so that I can see the whole room and open the floor for public comment. So are there any members of the public here this evening that want to share? You can raise your hand, or if you're not as familiar with the Zoom hand raising, just speak up and we can add you to the queue. Seeing a few screens light up, but I haven't heard anyone say they'd like to offer any questions or comment. Just give it another couple of minutes.
I see Judy's hand is up.
Yep. Hi, Judy. Go ahead, please.
I would just like to bring to your attention that even though we drafted this rubric many, many months ago, we were unaware that the Social Equity Caucus was creating their own equity probing questions. And the equity probing questions that they created and is being used by every chair in the House and considered in the Senate is much deeper than any of this. And so equity, according to a lot of this, is not met according to the legislators' equity probing question, the SEC's equity probing questions. I just wanted to bring those to your attention.
Yeah, thanks, Judy. I have to say, I personally wasn't aware of the equity probing questions that the legislature was using. Other members of our subcommittee may have been, though.
It comes from the Social Equity Caucus.
Yeah. And their intended audience, just a clarifying question, their intended audience is for legislative policy program, budget review.
For their committee to, when they work on a bill, they want the committee to ask, they want them to ask themselves these questions. Is there, you know, equity in this bill? If not, how will you mitigate it? Is certain, well, are certain people being targeted? I can read them to you actually, if you want them. Does the proposed legislation distribute wealth and resources to increase social well-being for racial ethnic groups most adversely impacted? Which individuals benefit from the proposed bill? If BIPOC, LGBTQ+, disability and migrant communities do not benefit, how can they? Why is the legislative committee seeking to address this issue? Is the purpose of the legislation to uplift the community most adversely impacted? What evidence has formed this bill? And how is the committee being informed by the people most impacted by the outcomes of the proposed bill? What resources are needed to engage the voices of experience of BIPOC, LGBTQ+, disability and migrant communities in a formulation of the bill? And how will these communities be engaged in the elevation of its success? Does the language termination of the bill reflect a self-identity of any groups mentioned? Are terms included that might be considered hurtful or damaging in nature? And what does the language reflect the temporal nature of social equity terms? How quickly will the committee most effectively affected by racial and social inequities begin to benefit for the proposed bill? And how does the bill address repair of broken relationships by dismantling systematic structures that cause harm? And how will the bill provide more equitable and just systems for all Vermonters? And could the bill have disparate negative impacts on underrepresented groups? If yes, how can disparate impact be mitigated? So that weighs heavily when you're looking at something, and we didn't have that information when the rubric was created.
Yeah, thank you for that comment, Judy. Thanks for sharing the questions. I think we'll have to find those in written form somewhere to make sure we can do some cross comparison.
I can't get them. I don't know if I can get them in the box or not. I'll try.
Okay.
If there's a link, I'd love to just be able to bookmark that too, because that's a lot to digest.
Yeah.
Well, it's on there. It's on Social Equity website page, if you can find that.
Great. Well, I think we can, yeah, let's look for it there.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
There we go.
Any other members of the public with question or comment that they want to provide this evening? Indra, thank you for helping me identify the hands raised. I was also trying to read the chat at the same time. Okay. Not seeing or hearing any others. Would the group like to go back to the equity assessment and try to go through line by line. I also, Jane, want to be respectful of the life cycle analysis topic that we had sort of targeted to happen about this same time. Do we want to jump to that quickly and then come? I just don't know how long that individual can be with us tonight.
Yeah, I mean, that's, like, Melanie is on the call. Melanie is going to support just a few slides. And Colin and I were going to introduce the project. The whole thing should take no more than 10 minutes. And so up to you guys.
So maybe I guess I'll
Sarah.
ask Melanie and Colin, like, are you able, if we return to, sorry, Sarah, I see that your hand's raised. Go ahead.
It's okay. I mean, I can use the chat box too, but I guess this is work that takes a certain amount of focused concentration. And I think it's very hard to leave a conversation like this half finished, change gears and come back to it. And also just want to recognize that a lot of members of this task force have joined us tonight. I would love to see us actually walk through together what Chase put together. And maybe my other subcommittee members don't want to do this, and if that's okay, that's fine. But my thought is it would be great to walk through what Chase put together and then have offer our reflections and share those with the task force members that are here. And to be able to do that today is sort of a new thing that we wanted to try as a subcommittee to try to play that role. And so I would love to see us do that.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I agree, that's sort of a big portion of this evening's agenda. Melanie and Colin, are you both comfortable if we take another 20 to 25 minutes or so, as long as it takes to sort of run through this equity assessment? Are you able to stay with us a little bit longer and then do your presentation a little off schedule on the agenda?
That works on our end. I don't know about for you, Colin.
Yeah, that should be fine for me too.
Okay, great. Thank you for being flexible. Okay, Sarah's made a proposal that we take the time to walk through the equity assessment. How are others feeling? Any opposition to that? Do a little negative polling here. Take about 20, 25 minutes to go through.
Hey, Abby, I wonder if it's possible to just pick like one or two of them for now, because it seems like I don't know which ones people would prioritize, but it might be hard to go through all of them.
If we don't go through all of them, will we have another time frame to discuss them?
Good question.
I'm curious if people have had a chance to review them in advance of this meeting, or if this is all brand new to most people. That they weren't put out very far in advance, but I did get a chance to look at them myself. Because what I would think is potentially, because there's a lot of what Chase has done is similar in answer in a lot of these things. So if you've reviewed them, there might be some standout ones that we can do and talk about and not have to go in order.
Okay. I'd like to try to make it through this whole document. I agree. I think it's lengthy. I have not had much time with the document, so I don't feel like I'm able to identify which categories in the rubric have similar responses from Chase. I know that Chase is currently on. I don't know what your connectivity and audio is like, Chase, but we could start with number one and see where there's similarity and just kind of begin and see how it goes. I'm going to keep us on a little bit of a time, so I'm going to say by 5:20 we're going to change gears. So let's kind of keep that time frame in mind as we go through each of the sections. So I'm happy to do the screen share. I'm not necessarily volunteering to be the one that feels like a subject matter expert on this document to make reference to Chase's comments. So I'm going to look to someone else that's feeling more comfortable with the document to do that. Either Chase yourself or someone else. But here we are, the first category, which is frontline most impacted communities, well defined in the proposal. Who's feeling like they want to take a try at referencing the comments that are here, or even speak to the scoring of a 1 and a 2 in this category? Sarah, I see your hand raised.
Yeah, so again, recognizing this is the first time we've gone through this exercise as a group. And so, you know, for Ginny and Indra and Sebi and Liz and others on the committee, I think what we're looking for here, right, the point of the scoring rubric and the equity assessment that we created was to ask people to see if they are addressing these issues in their proposal. And so we're saying, have they identified frontline and impacted communities? Have they defined them? And how well are those defined and understood? And I guess I'm seeing that there is some definition around it. But you know, even in tonight's conversation, some question around numbers and understanding the scope and scale of the communities we're talking about is something that's missing. I'm also seeing that Chase has said that this is a 1 and then maybe a 2 in the sense that it's more clearly identifying employee or the forest landowners as being in community. So I'm curious if that, I'm not sure how we see this conversation going, and you know, would welcome feedback from others, but I think that this is an accurate, you know, I think there's a lot missing here that we would be looking for as a subcommittee, that let me just speak for myself, that I would be looking for in terms of identifying who exactly are the impacted communities.
Sarah, thanks for being brave and doing the first version. I just want to maybe do one tiny little backup for those that may not be familiar, and then I'm going to keep us moving forward. But the 1, 2, and the 3. So if people aren't familiar with ever using the rubric prior, the 1 would be that there's likely more information that's needed or a modification to the proposal or the recommendation to sort of meet kind of the expectation of addressing that subset criteria within the rubric. A 2 means that there may be some opportunity for enhancement, and a 3 means that the recommendation is meeting expectation of the criteria. So when we have 1s and 2s in this first one, that may mean that there's room for improvement or further definition or more detail being provided. So I see Judy, and then Carrie, and then Claire.
Thank you. Several times we've heard tonight that this is the first time you're using this rubric. It's been created for a long time, and a lot of things have gone through your committee. Could you explain why this is the first time you're using it?
Judy, I'll just speak like it. Our committee said that this is something that as subcommittees and others are putting forward proposals, they should be using. It was never the intention of this committee that we would be responsible for scoring other people's work. And so the charge that we gave was that, for instance, your task group should be using this scoring rubric when you're doing your work to understand what's missing in your proposal. It wasn't the intention that our subcommittee would be the ones always using the rubric and scoring everything. And that's the work that Kaya did with the Climate Council subcommittees back initially, was to help them use this proposal. So more recently, and when I say this is the first time, is that more recently our subcommittee has discussed that we would like people to bring their rubric to us for discussion so that we are holding folks accountable for using it. And this is the first time that we have asked a group to bring it back to us. So that's what I meant when I said first time.
Okay, so are we to assume then that any recommendations your committee put through did not go through a rubric process with you?
Our subcommittee didn't put forward recommendations for specific, I guess maybe I'm not understanding your question, but I don't want to, I shouldn't be getting, I'll defer to Abby in terms of how to facilitate the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah, Judy, I think we could have I might suggest that we have a offline conversation about the Just Transition Subcommittee recommendations. We did make a few recommendations to the Climate Action Plan, but they weren't about, they were really more around the equity lens and about using the rubric and doing trainings, but not around specific recommendations for change in the climate community or in the landscape.
That's exactly why I'm asking the question.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. I want to kind of hold the question for the moment, and I'd love to have further conversation with you about it. So thanks for asking it. Might just be that I need to prepare a little bit to be able to answer and respond to you accurately. So I want to move to Carrie and Claire. Or go ahead, Kelly. Do you want to respond to that?
I think I might be able to put it succinctly. In the climate action plan that was put forward at the end of 2021, we as a committee did not put forward any policy proposals. Our biggest contribution was the Just Transition guiding principles and this rubric. And so I think that, yeah, unlike the other committees that put forward policy proposals and things, that was not the role of the Just Transition Subcommittee.
Thanks, Kelly. Okay, Carrie, Claire, please.
Hi. I said I have my camera plugged in, so you can't see me anyway. Looking at this rubric, it occurs to me that this is an assessment tool. So maybe it's a tool to help make a proposal better is the lens I'm looking at it through. So when I read through the first paragraph of comments where it's been ranked a 1, I think it might be helpful to have more constructive comments of like, okay, right now it's assessed as a 1, but what types of work would need to happen to have that be a 3? Because right now it's sort of like a report card and like getting pretty low scores. So I wonder like who that's helpful to. That's all.
Thanks, Carrie. Okay, Claire, please.
Thanks. I think I actually had, well, 2 comments. One was very similar to Carrie's, which was feeling like a way to improve this going forward would be to add comments about the data that would be necessary to evaluate some of the points that Chase highlights that weren't addressed appropriately. So really just reinforcing what Carrie said. And my second thought was related to what Sarah had said, which feels like in some ways to evaluate the recommendations, it feels like, and I don't know, maybe this is planned for a future iteration, there almost needs to be a more of a background section for someone who hasn't been deeply involved in the work of the task group, which we were able to get through some of the questions with task group members here tonight around, clearly there's been consideration of the impacted communities that just, at least from my perspective, wasn't reflected in the recommendation, the written document on some level. So just maybe thinking through if the recommendations were to actually be adopted into the climate action plan, some of that could be provided as context, both in advance of the specific kind of action items would be helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. I don't know if this feels helpful, but one of the things that I remember our subcommittee contemplating around this concept of inviting task groups and other members to bring their recommendations to our Just Transition Subcommittee was that we didn't feel comfortable to ever be the subject matter experts, but instead could sort of ask some of the probing questions or ask for task groups and others to kind of further explain or consider these sections, this different criteria area. So I think there's this fine balance of like, our subcommittee is never going to be able to take on the leadership and expertise in all the recommendation topic areas, but instead just sort of take ownership over asking some of the questions from an equity lens. Okay, David, and then Liz.
Yeah, I want to endorse Claire and Carrie's comments in terms of what should be included as part of this. Because in fact, one of the things I wanted to do when I first read this was I wanted to get out a pencil and start just writing that we're missing the fabric of some of the issue, and to direct people to look at certain things. And I think if that discipline were applied and that opportunity were made available, it could be helpful.
Thank you. Liz, and then Judy.
Thank you. And it's really clarifying to hear that other committees have made proposals, but we haven't yet. And I wonder if that's something we should consider. But I also just have a question on just looking at this for frontline impacted communities. You know, with my background, I really am struggling to understand how landowners are frontline. I'm usually, you know, there's a difference in my mind between earned and unearned income. So, and wage labor and, you know, sort of feudal privileges, to put it bluntly. So I just would love more clarity around landowners as seen in the framework of frontline communities.
Thanks for that comment, Liz. I think at this point, it may make sense. Did Indra or Kelly, did either of you want to respond to that specifically, or Billy?
That was why I raised my hand. It's when we did this framework, it was frontline and or impacted. And so the landowners are impacted. Should they get equal weight to frontline and impacted, or just frontline? Maybe not. And that's a question we have to ask.
So Billy, I'm willing to take kind of comments out of order. If you want to respond directly to Liz's, if you have your hand raised for another reason, I'm going to move to Judy.
Yeah, go ahead with Judy. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Judy, you're next.
I would just like to mention that the comments that people are making about missing information and how things would help you feel better have been discussed at our committee level. So then perhaps what's missing is our report to you is so concise. I mean, for instance, we've had 12 scientists talk to us. 12. That's a lot. So we've had many questions answered. We've used the guiding principles where there was supposed to be fairness to everything. We've used the Global Warming Solutions Act where there was supposed to be equity involved. We've talked about all of that. And there's just a lot of things that we've talked about that aren't in that little 2-page recommendation. So maybe the process is the problem, that we just didn't get it to you in a proper way. But the questions you're asking is there. We know the answers. We did it.
Thanks, Judy. So I'm seeing 3 hands raised. I'm going to try to go in order. I think we are kind of utilizing this process a little differently than we had originally imagined. And so I think that's part of where there's some confusion here. But I'm going to look to Billy, Jane, and Indra in that order. Go ahead, Billy.
Quickly, I just say we did hear a lot of information. We heard some information that conflicted. I don't think there's consensus amongst the group, and that's part of the challenge and the recommendations we brought forward. The specific point I wanted to make was about this first analysis. And one piece that I think is missing is the economic impacts on the Burlington community, particularly if they were to close their baseload renewable energy source, and what impacts that might have on kind of frontline communities, the folks within the Burlington Electric District. That's something we haven't gotten any, that's not baked into this.
Thank you. Jane.
I was just gonna, my hand went up because I just wanted to reflect what Judy said, and maybe Indra's gonna build on this or go in a different direction, but this is I think we were kind of thinking of this as like a trial run, a process for how bringing forward an equity scoring rubric completed by another subcommittee or task group would work for this subcommittee. And I just wanted to reflect on what Judy said, and what I heard is that it is hard to convey 9 months of work in one quick presentation and one set of recommendations. And I think that's why the benefit of the equity scoring rubric was put forward, so that the onus and the burden of completing it and thinking about it is really on the group that had benefited from all of that, those presentations and discourse and dialogue. So I just want to just challenge you all to think about what an appropriate role is for the subcommittee in having a presentation like this and trying to digest the group's thoughts about the application of the scoring rubric and what the specific sort of input from Just Transitions is, understanding that it would be hard to sort of bring forward all this conversation. And so just wanted to say that this is the first time that you all have trying to do this, and just want to know that we should reflect on how it works and what we can take away to improve upon the process going forward.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jane. Indra.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna try to address 3 different things. One, why haven't we used this before? I think we asked that question for a long time as committee members. Why are we not using it? And that was a question that we talked over and over again. And now finally we are using it. So it's a good, step into the progress. One. Number 2, I think we really need to go back and define what we are saying. Because and I have done a lot of equity audit, that I'll say. And Taze, you took on a very difficult job. It's really hard to audit any policy action from an equity lens without having a full context in mind. Because as I was reading this, it kind of shows me that the rural versus BIPOC divide that a lot of people talk about when we talk about equity, as if the equity benefits only one group versus the other, right? Even in the report, I kind of get that sense. I don't think that's what it is. Even in the rural communities, people who are left out, economically marginalized, systematically marginalized, if we can center them in our analysis, and if we clearly define them in the beginning, I don't think there is a fight between BIPOC and folks who are really systematically left behind. And I think that's our job, to really clearly define. And the final thing is, again, we are starting to do this, and it's great. And once we do it, we learn what works and what doesn't work. For me, what works is utilizing the toolkit that we have, and really in the last meeting, we talked about amending it, revising it as we go forward. And earlier, when we heard about the social equity caucus framework, maybe that's something that we can utilize in order to revise this, right? But also in the process perspective, when I'm a consultant, I spend hours and hours with an organization to understand what they have done, even to start grading them, if I may use that word, right? In this committee, we won't have a lot of time and capacity. Maybe the proper process for us to do is first define all of this very clearly, just so that everybody in the subcommittee has a clear understanding on what is it that we are looking for. Second, each of the committee members will, all the people who are making those recommendation policy, they will come do the presentation and be available for Q&A after, just so that we can get the answer to the questions that we are asking, rather than making any assumption. And collectively we can grade, or we can have a small subcommittee that can do it. So I kind of see us go through that process and have a roadmap of how do we do it in the future. So it's a great try, I think. And after asking why are we not utilizing the toolkit that we have, what is our role in the conversation about, equity in climate justice? I think we have started to use this toolkit, and there are some mistakes, but I think like we are headed to that direction of like, what is it that we are learning? So that's all I have to say.
Thanks, Sandra. Judy.
Yeah, I want to give you an example of why I think Chase is spot on here. In our committee meetings, and these are not reflected in this paragraph, we learned the average age of a hospital visit for a child living in this area for an asthma attack is 10 years old. The average age of a hospital visit for someone from COPD is 20 years old. Those are numbers that are way down from what they were in 2013. So the average age of these attacks is younger and younger every time. And that's not reflected in there, but we've discussed it. The other thing is, Chase has used the word landowners several times in here. And I want you to visualize this 1 acre circle. We're talking about marginalized people. We're talking about low income people. And we're talking about the projects are there. And these people are living, the smokestacks are not above where they live. They're even with where they live. Because the smokestacks are in a valley and the people are just above the valley. So they're even. So all of that stuff was discussed. The science was given. We know all of that, but it's not reflected in here. And I see that Chase has given this some deep thought, and I believe he's marked it accordingly. But unless you had that data, you wouldn't know that.
Thank you, Judy. Kelly.
Thank you, Judy. That's really helpful. And I've had the benefit of hearing some discussions around the biomass recommendations, attending one of the public meetings. And it's so clear that so much time and thought and debate and everything has gone into those recommendations. And the fact that they're not, a tome with all of the things you learned and all of the things you wanted to put in, the fact that you got it short like that is impressive, but also it must have been really tough to try to, wanting to put it all in there. And from a 10,000 foot view, what I'm seeing from Chase's exercise of filling out the scoring rubric, and really it, as many people have said, I think it was intended to be done by the people who were putting the policy together to get them to think. And it's maybe what we should be asking each of the task groups or subcommittees to do is have every single person fill it out on their own, come together, and then come to us with what they've put together, and then maybe we can give feedback then. I don't know. And so as interested, we're learning, we're trying to figure out how to make this good and help everybody do good work and center equity in what we're doing. So my 10,000 foot view of what I got from reading through Chase's reflections was that the memo that was put together, the recommendations that were put together by the biomass task group identified where the holes are. And so we know what we don't know. So that's a really big step. But now we need to know, okay, we know that there are people who live in this area who are impacted. We haven't had a chance to talk to them. We need to talk to them. We need to make them part of the process going forward. And that's why has to be a study. There has to be public outreach. And so that was what I got from it. And from each section, I was seeing the same kind of thing. It was that the people who are living there, who are most closely associated with, especially the McNeil plant, but Rygate has other things going on with it, the rural community around it and the nature around it, but that we haven't gone there, we haven't talked to the people, we haven't had that opportunity, and that's the next major step that has to be taken. So that to me is very clear, and the 1s and 1.5s and 2s aren't necessarily saying the thing put forward by the biomass task group is a failure. It's that they've figured out where they need to take the next step.
I appreciate that. My family has lived there for 2 centuries, at least. And I know many of those people. I invited several to the meeting that we had at the Interville facilities, and one came and he asked questions and he still hasn't gotten answers. So, and I do know the medical center has done their own survey of that area. And so there's things out there, but that's why we asked for an investigation. It has to be collected.
I'd like to take Claire and Liv's comments and then move to maybe some parting words and then back to Melanie and Colin.
I can be quick. I was just reminded that, or was thinking about how we also have, in addition to the rubric that Chase filled out, we do have or had developed the self-assessment questions, which seem kind of like maybe not quite as in-depth as the questions Judy read out from the Equity Caucus, but do seem to touch on a lot of the questions that we asked tonight. Like, which frontline and impacted communities might be most impacted? How do they experience inequity? How have they been part of creating and implementing this recommendation? It seems like those questions would be a really nice complement, either to have alongside this rubric or to structure the presentation that Inder was mentioning, or so it seems like it gets at some of what we're highlighting is missing for us to evaluate this, and it sounds like the task group has considered, and that really maybe those tools, if used together, will fill in some of the pieces that we're talking about tonight.
Thanks for that suggestion, Claire. Liz.
Appreciate all the additional context given here tonight. And first, I have a comment and a question. So first, I want to just acknowledge the fact that the harm of pollution is very real, but the harm of joblessness is also very real and leads to death and devastation in families. And I don't see these being as mutually opposed to each other in opposition, but I always want to make sure that both are being addressed, especially, given my role as a working class organization. And I wonder, since there is no just transition plan developed, is there a role for this committee in developing a plan for these recommendations in closing these plants?
Thank you, Liz. All right, well, I know that we didn't make it as far as we thought we might. I appreciate those that are referencing that this is progress, it's a step in the right direction. We're engaging the guiding principles in the ways that we said that we would, that we're trying something new, and that can be clunky and hard to begin with. So I really appreciate the Biomass Task Group members for joining us. I don't know if we feel like we're at a place of offering some recommendations or final suggestions around the biomass recs at this point, but I think we're starting a process together, and I don't know that I have the succinct summary to say what's next, but just acknowledging that the work remains undone from our perspective. I also want to, I think there was just a comment made by Judy that we can address the rest of this rubric at a later time, at another meeting. And then Liz asking if we have a role in creating a just transitions proposal in response to other committees' proposals. Was the comment that Liz made, and then has reiterated in the chat that she's just looking for some response there. So I think, Liz, that's actually a conversation for the subcommittee to consider, and I think we can just add that to an agenda and make sure that we don't lose that question. All right, I know that Jane also invited Melanie and Colin to make a brief presentation around the life cycle analysis. And one of the objectives from this conversation was to recognize that as a new kind of assembled group, that we don't have a just transition subcommittee member liaison to that task group. And that's an important piece potentially for us to consider to see who might want to attend some of those conversations. So I'm happy to turn it over to Melanie and Colin or Jane, whoever wants to kick that part off.
I really thank you for allowing us some time on the agenda tonight, and thanks for Melanie and Colin for sticking with us. I just wanted to briefly introduce the work of the life cycle analysis group, and I thought it would be helpful because it's a complicated topic and one that touches a lot of areas that your subcommittee, I believe, is interested in. And the work that we're doing under the contract has a specific role of inviting in voices into the process through targeted stakeholder engagement with frontline and impacted communities. I wanted to just spend 5 minutes with Melanie giving you an overview of the life cycle analysis project in an effort to sort of ground you in what that work is and invite members from the subcommittee on the task group as the work really dives into earnest. Moves forward in earnest, I should say, and because we don't have any representation from Just Transitions on that task group right now, and so really wanted to invite folks in and think that there's a relevant role in particular on this work. So I want to turn it over. Melanie Sands is our project manager who's on the contract with ERG. She will introduce herself and the company who's working with us, orient you briefly, and then we can walk away, hopefully, either with you all providing space for you all to reach out to me with further questions, or hopefully having some volunteers, a volunteer or two, to work with us on the task group going forward over the next 9 months or so to develop this work. Thanks,
Great.
Melanie, so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. And actually, so I'm Melanie Sands. I'm a senior social scientist with Eastern Research Group, and our company is based in Lexington, Massachusetts, although I actually live in Middlebury, Vermont, which is how I've kind of started wiggling my way into some more Vermont-specific projects. I'm actually here with my colleague, Jake Namovich, tonight, and he is a sustainability and life cycle assessment analyst at ERG, and we're going to kind of tag team this quick overview. Basically, as Jane set it up, just kind of giving you a brief overview of our project, a little bit about LCA in general, and then I'll kind of come back in with the stakeholder engagement piece that how we're hoping to potentially engage some people from this group. So I will turn it over to Jake as he walks us through a little bit about our project scope and a little bit of high-level explanation of LCA.
Sure. Can everyone hear me to start off? Right on. Okay. As Melanie said, my name is Jake, and I am a lifecycle assessment and sustainability analyst with the Lifecycle Services Division of ERG. So as for the scope of this project that we are collaborating with Vermont on, we will be assessing all existing and emerging Vermont energy sources that will pertain to the state. We've been relying on the Comprehensive Energy Plan, the Climate Action Plan. Additional resources outside of those will be used to gather as full a picture as we can on all energy sources that are used in Vermont and are speculated to be used in the future. On this sub bullet point, you can see a few examples. We'll be looking at fossil fuels, biofuels, and bio-based fuels. I know that biomass has been the central topic for this call today, and we will be examining that too. We'll be looking at renewables, hydro, and then all of the fuels and energy sources that incoming electricity from other states rely upon for production. It should be stated that the singular focus of this project is on greenhouse gases, and obviously there are other topics that absolutely and inexorably connect to energy production and reliance within the state that can be examined, but as for the scope of this project, we're only looking at greenhouse gases. Included in that will be biogenic carbon dioxide as well, which is coming from those bio-based sources. We will make sure to be using publicly available data for transparency in our calculations and our methods for developing these life cycle assessments on each energy source. And as Melanie will touch on in a few slides here, we will be developing ways to incorporate stakeholder input. A little background on life cycle assessment, though. The International Organization for Standards definition of LCA, the abbreviation of it, is the compilation and evaluation of the inputs, outputs, and the potential environmental impacts of a product system throughout its life cycle. And on the right here, you can see a diagram that sort of is a cursory overview of how we can begin thinking about this. You start with the raw extraction of materials or harvesting of resources from the earth. You process it, you use it, you dispose it, or make use of it again. And one who is practicing life cycle assessment works to capture the entire system of focus. And in the case of this project, it'll be many systems for each energy source. And we'll be looking at the cradle to grave or end use perspective for these sources and quantifying the greenhouse gases associated with each of those stages. As for the benefits and limitations of LCA, the benefits, we get to quantify and put numbers to certain activities that we engage in the economy. In this case, it'll be on energy production, and we can then associate types of pollutants that on average are released during those activities and quantify environmental impacts associated with them. The LCA serves as a decision aid. It's best to conduct them before decision making. This way we can sort of have a sort of list of what pollutants are associated with each of these energy sources, weigh the benefits and costs of pursuing one pathway over another, and sort of educate decisions on that basis. It should be said that LCA is limited in terms of what it can analyze, and other tools can be used in conjunction to LCA as a complement and to sort of examine those blind spots. Finally, it helps to avoid unintended consequences and balance trade-offs. As for limitations, LCAs are constrained by available data and the level of data that is available. So we are not performing primary data collection. We are relying on data sources that exist to create these models. And our model can only go as far as the data allows. There could be mismatches in terms of the time that the study that is feeding into our model was conducted. There could be technological differences in the data sets. So that's all something that an LCA practitioner works to mitigate in terms of mismatches and really maximize making the model as identical to real world conditions as we can. And it does not always produce clear decision pathways. It's producing those numbers, but it's really up to communities and decision makers to understand the costs and benefits of different decisions and to make decisions on the basis of sort of what the results are. There may be instances where it looks very good from a climate perspective, but as we've been talking about in this call, there can be human health impacts associated with some of these sources. So really, it's not a one-to-one comparison, and decisions have to be weighed as such. Final point, the LCA has traditionally been most powerful in applications examining things like climate change, but the framework has really been adapted in the past few decades to examine other impact categories such as human health, biodiversity loss, land use change, and it can only go so far in those dimensions. It relies on average data. So again, more complementary methods are required to get sort of location specific results and sort of conclusions on the impacts of these energy sources. I'm going to hand it over to Melanie now to talk about stakeholder input.
Thanks, Jake. So kind of touching on everything that we have, well, you all have been talking about on your call today and your other previous meetings. And then with what Jake was saying too, we're really looking to try to involve stakeholders from the beginning of this LCA project to really help guide and provide input on the current analysis, but also provide input that we can use to shape subsequent work around energy pathways and maybe expanded life cycle analysis, the type that Jake was just saying. So in trying to really incorporate equity from the beginning, one of the ways that we're looking to do that is to hold a couple of stakeholder meetings on this current project. And really the first meeting would be to share some of the information that we have to date by that point in the project, which would be early in the project, about the energy pathways that we're thinking about using in the analysis, running that past stakeholders, getting their buy-in and perspective on if we're missing anything or there are other considerations that we have not included, things of that nature. And then later in the project, we would have another meeting that's sharing preliminary results, getting input on if those results align with people's experiences, considerations for how that information could be used in decision-making or moving forward. So in addition to pieces around this current analysis, one of the things we would also like to do in engaging stakeholders through these meetings is really trying to get information that can be used to set up more expanded analyses in the future that do touch on things like public health, that tie in more with different aspects of environmental justice or disadvantaged or frontline communities, biodiversity, things like that. So what we had discussed with the project team is that in addition to getting input for this current piece of work, sorry, it's late in the day for me, I start stumbling. The other thing would be that we would try to collect input for future analyses and put that in a scoping document that would essentially lay out, this is what we're hearing from stakeholders, these are things of value, these are things to be considered, and combine that with what we're learning in the technical part of the analyses in terms of available data, data gaps, things of that nature, to basically set everybody up for future work that continues to build off of this first analysis. So really in doing that, we wanted to, I know that a couple people mentioned it could be potentially helpful if there is someone who can be willing to be a liaison from this subcommittee to the LCA task group. We're really hoping to have some more insight into identifying the stakeholders that should be included, considerations for engaging those stakeholders, and making sure we're really thoughtful about our meeting design and content in a way that really embraces some of the equity intentions and focus and practices this group has been discussing and really working on. So I can pause there. I know we're throwing a lot at you really quickly. I believe that Jane or someone had posted this presentation with the meeting agenda and items, so it's there for you to review. And there's sort of a backlog of slides after this short snippet that are more detailed about if you want to learn more about LCA, which I know that the project is just starting, so there will be other opportunities to get into some of that. But maybe I'll pause there.
Thanks, Melanie. So I guess just to hone in on the ask and the opportunity to learn more, I do just want to acknowledge that all the contracts that the Climate Action Office is moving forward right now, and the life cycle analysis is just one of them, all have this vision of having broader public participation, whether it's through what's called stakeholder engagement, whether it's called public engagement, community engagement. There's a lot of different components, and just want to acknowledge Sarah's good question in the chat around sort of how we're thinking about getting a more diverse group of Vermonters to participate in these. And that's something I think we as the Climate Office need to be thinking about with the support of our new facilitation and community engagement contract that we'll have that envisions the application of community liaisons and focus groups, and then carrying forward work with communities long-term and how we do that through equitable pay for people participating in that. We'll want to really think about how we do that holistically, and this contract is just one part of that. So for just to hone in, I know you all have, this has been a long meeting, and I'm sorry that things didn't stay on focus all the time, but the ask really here is an acknowledgement that the life cycle analysis is a technical contract that really considers how we track and quantify greenhouse gases from our energy choices, from not just within Vermont, but the impact of those energy choices from the creation of them all the way to the end use and disposal of them. We acknowledge that energy choices have more than greenhouse gas impacts. They have impacts on forests, they have impacts on health and equity. And those are the kinds of things that we want to lift up, not necessarily in the LCA, but acknowledge those other components and think about ways that we can reflect them in decision-making going forward. So I really think that and the community engagement component, it will be really beneficial to have someone from JT involved in the work. And really the task group doesn't meet very often at strategic touch points with the contract, so that input is garnered when best utilized. And so just like any task group, it would be great to have one or two. And I will acknowledge that Chase was willing to do that because he's very interested in this, but also want to acknowledge that Chase has been critical in the biomass task group, and there's room for more than just one or others at the table if folks are interested in this.
So I just want to respond to the request of the subcommittee. Really appreciate being asked to help with the stakeholder engagement process. One of what I recall from a prior contract relationship that we had that was really helpful for this subcommittee was for us to react to something. So kind of like bringing a list of, targeted or invited populations or individuals that we could then have as like a document, a shareable document that we could add organizations or add individuals or provide contact information. And the same around kind of a meeting design and content. So like if we saw an agenda or a flow that you were considering, then we could offer feedback around how to better organize. I think, I don't know how that fits with the timeline of when things will happen and when we have our monthly meetings, as Jane mentioned, but that would be my recommendation. I don't know if other subcommittee members want to propose something else.
So we can certainly bring things to the full subcommittee at strategic points, but typically, like, I'll just ask that you've normally appointed a liaison to specific task groups or work. And so that my hope was that there would be someone, so it wasn't someone who could represent the interest all along the way in the process. And then where they especially highlighted the benefit of coming to the full subcommittee, then we could do that also. But yeah, and Chase could be that if that's the capacity right now, because Chase has said he would do that. But I just wanted to carry forward the message of the greater project and then see if anybody else was interested. And happy to reflect questions after the meeting too. And if anybody's interested, they can come forward, knowing that at least Chase was also interested.
Okay, so I'm gonna call on Judy, but I'll just put to the subcommittee that if there's anyone else that's also interested in possibly being a liaison to the the life cycle analysis group, to think about that, and we'll raise that question again in another few minutes. So Judy.
Thank you for the presentation. I have a couple of questions. Number one, could you define stakeholders?
I think that's actually one of the things that we talked about at our kickoff meeting. And Judy, I think that's one of the things we're hoping to have some insight from people in this group, because I think we initially in the contract, it was the phrase traditional ecological knowledge and stakeholders were connected. And we were talking in our early meetings, we've only been in the project about a couple weeks now. We were talking about whether or not that needs to be expanded to other populations. And so I think that's one of the things we need to initially nail down. So I guess the short answer is that hasn't been defined yet. And I think we're hoping to get some input so that we're defining in a way that is most helpful and meaningful based on this group's experience.
Okay, and my second question is, the slide that showed the cradle to death was like a complete circle. There are things that come into play, thank you, before the cradle part, right? Like, we've been talking about McNeil, let's talk about them. So there's the person who cuts the log down, there's the person who skids it down the mountain, there's the person who brings it to the chipper, there's the person who chips it and brings it to the trains, and there's the diesel in the train, and there's the person that unloads it. All of that will be a tentacle that comes to play on this before the cradle, right?
Correct. That's sort of encapsulated in that cradle going into processing phase. We're trying to capture, all the burdens that are associated with producing energy using these sources. So all those steps that you raised, Judy, are going to be captured, or will rely on data sets that hopefully so comprehensively capture that level of detail. But yes, we aspire to replicate real world conditions associated with Vermont's energy sources.
And the other question is all about what are you capturing? Are you capturing CO2? Are you capturing the total of that? Are you capturing other toxic materials? What are you capturing in this life cycle assessment?
We're going to be capturing principal greenhouse gases of focus. So N2O, methane, carbon dioxide, and then there's going to be the addition of biogenic carbon dioxide, CO2 that's re-released into the atmosphere after being sequestered in biomass. So those will be our focus group greenhouse gases.
Okay, and sorry, one more. What is your intent on how you plan on bringing TEK in?
So that's been another discussion point of ours for these internal meetings. Is a lot of these sources are not at all sensitive to the ecosystems from which they're extracted. Most relevantly in Vermont, there is this discussion of biomass, and the whole notion of TEK in these contexts can be difficult to capture in LCA models. So then it becomes a question of, is it appropriate to be examining TEK within the scope of this project? These are all discussions that must be had, and it would be wrong to implement any sort of claims regarding TEK in this study if all the proper channels for assessing the most sustainable sourcing of these fuels and other inputs to the energy system are not, being managed by folks who are tied to the land, etc. So go ahead.
It's kind of my understanding you already signed a contract saying you would do that.
Correct.
Okay, so you are or you are not going to do it?
Well, I think that one of the things that I would say, and I guess part of it, Judy, is that it's still being discussed how best to do that. And I think it's sort of how we also landed in this, trying to get as much feedback as we can in the current process for also not just to get preliminary impact or input for this current analysis, but how we really feel that a more expanded analysis would be preferable to integrating things that impact TEK. And I think by developing that scoping document and some other information to set up some future work that maybe might be better aligned with that. So I think we're going to have to just do what we can to integrate. I think it's the two pieces. One, in terms of how you were saying, how are we defining stakeholders and who should be providing input and having that discussion, and trying to get input on the current analysis. And are we being thoughtful in terms of the energy pathways specific to greenhouse gases, but then also being mindful that an expanded LCA might be able to take into consideration some factors that might be more closely overlapping with TEK, and capturing that and setting that up for an additional piece of work.
And if I may add as well, the sort of meat of LCA is purely descriptive of real world conditions, and it, you know, a lot of those conditions are not virtuous to, you know, tenets of TEK. So there's only so much that can be captured in sort of a traditional life cycle assessment, but echoing Melanie's comments, other forms of study will complement the results of this and can more virtuously align with what TEK stands for and how it can be relevant to the energy systems in Vermont.
Okay.
So I'm going to bring us back in our last few minutes to a question that was posed in the chat, and then by Kelly and then seconded by Sebi, which is to sort of provide a little bit more information to our subcommittee about the time expectation that you're imagining of, so like how many meetings would happen, thinking about compensation and whether these are public meetings and that would be part of a per diem or therefore qualify for the hourly pay rate. Just, I think, a few questions that our group would be looking for before we can identify someone to serve as that liaison. And I saw, Jane, that you wrote something. Okay.
Yeah, I was just suggesting that it's roughly 3 to 5 task group meetings. It's not a commitment like the other task groups. It's in support of managing a contract. So 3 to 5 task group meetings that would roughly be an hour.
And so then folks would be eligible for the per diem or the hourly rate?
The hourly rate for task groups only. Mm-hmm.
And to clarify, is that 3 to 5 meetings total? Are they over the course of a month? Is it 3 to 5 in 1 week? I would just.
Sorry, the contract, it goes through the end of the summer. So it would be 3 to 5 meetings between now and I think it's end of August. And I envision with the task group.
Thanks. I'm not volunteering, but if I were, I would want to know all this. I'm asking for others who maybe aren't.
Thank you. Yeah,
I appreciate that clarification as well.
Sorry, I just have a quick question. I know we're almost at time.
That's okay. Go ahead.
But just to the idea of incorporating sort of stakeholder input, I just want to make sure that I kind of have it right, because like a greenhouse gas life cycle assessment, like you could argue is sort of like objective to the point that Jane, you were making about like, I mean, there's room for error in the accounting, but it's like, it's a pretty technical process. And so are you mostly, I assume you're not like looking for people to say, oh, you missed this energy source or like this other white paper on like how much it actually emits as a standard. So is the primary input on future projects, like scoping for future projects, not necessarily feedback that would be incorporated into the report itself to fulfill this contract?
Yeah,
I think that's fair.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just, I mean, I think we could go into some more detail on that, but I think that's a largely fair assessment to keep it brief.
Okay.
Okay, so I think for now, we're hearing that there was interest from Chase, and Claire's already participating in the subcommittee from the science and data perspective. So there might be a few individuals and possibly others that may
I'd be
want
willing to join as well.
Okay, thank you, Sebi.
Sounds interesting and
Yeah,
worthwhile.
Thanks. Mhm.
Great, and it's good to know, Judy, that you're on the committee as well. Okay, Melanie and Jake, thanks for sharing and joining us. We are always overly ambitious in our agenda setting than what we actually have time for. So we did not have space for our reflection time. We didn't get to the public engagement plan. Again, Claire, I'm so sorry. Thanks for just remaining patient to share all that good work and kind of inspire us about how it's starting to change how people are doing government work. So I did want to just maybe spend 1 minute on the co-chair kind of process. So I am not the expert on this, even though I am one of the co-chairs, but ideally it would be nice to have more than one chair. I think by kind of expectation, we would have a co-chair from a member of the Climate Council. So at this moment in time, those two individuals that remain Climate Council reps are Kelly and Sue. And Sue has stepped down as co-chair. Kelly has expressed interest and willingness with time constraints and limitations, as we all have, but like wanting to kind of really protect and honor the fact that Kelly is interested, but with constraints. And Chase has also expressed interest and willingness to co-chair with also time constraints. I don't know if there's others from within the subcommittee. We recognize, that's a very white presenting co-chair team, and wanted to make sure that there was opportunity for other subcommittee members that may be interested in stepping into the co-chair shared responsibility of chairship.
And I think, again, we should probably spell out how much time it is, what the per diem compensation is, and all of that. Yeah, there can be 3 co-chairs. We've had 4 at one point. Sarah was one of them. So that could maybe be something we send out to the committee. I think for today, what we need to do is at least officially say, because there has to be a representative from the council who's a co-chair. So if we can say, and I can, I won't be offended if you say no, but I think I have to be a co-chair. Whether I can do it, and then the steering committee meets tomorrow, I think, and can just like officially make it happen, and then we can add more people at a later date if people are interested.
Sorry, do we need like a motion or something to make Kelly a co-chair?
Yeah, I think, it would be nice to just see if we have general support of Kelly stepping into that role as co-chair.
I support it.
Representative, or any concerns? Thank you, Kelly. Thanks everyone for sharing your perspective. So Jane, you or Marion will bring that to the steering committee. Is that clear process?
Yes, and just so folks know, we're also going to just talk about subcommittee, like counselors getting appointed to subcommittees process going forward, and the March meeting of the council is the first in-person meeting ever of the Climate Council. And there's going to be a lot of talk about sort of the work of the council, the role of subcommittees, capacity, all of that in this interim phase between now and the next plan, and really charting a course for roles and responsibilities. And I expect updates to like the process roadmap and things like that, that really help guide and steer the ship sort of in this phase of ongoing Climate Council work, rather than the document and the guidance that was put to sort of stand it all up. So looking forward to sort of reconvening and talking about that in the next few weeks.
Judy has her hand up.
Yeah, Judy.
Thank you for entertaining my questions tonight. I just want to know, I'm not sure I got an answer. Will we be addressing the rest of the things on the rubric?
I don't know if I understand the question.
So the rubric that Chase sent you,
Mhm.
right? We only discussed the first one. Will we be discussing the rest of the items on that rubric? Because as you saw, there was a learning experience that went along with that first rubric. And as I'm sure you can surmise, there will be with the rest of them as well.
I think I can speak for me and not for the committee. This was one of the exercises that we have been wanting to do, because for the longest time, I have seen Just Transition Committee really struggle to define what exactly is it that we are charged to do. And one of the things that we started thinking about is like, there is a toolkit that exists, and that is the equity framework that exists, and let's start using it. And tonight we used it. And for me personally, there was some learning, which generally is, very different than when I am a consultant for an organization. And I think like I would propose that we revisit, how do we define the equity audit process, like using the rubric and whatnot into the future. And if there is a willingness, like we can go and really take a look at like in-depth look at the rubric that was presented. I think that will be a great learning experience.
Thank you.
The process I was going to suggest is similar to what you just said, Indra, which is just to circle back and say, hey, we learned a lot from that first dip into this, and let's figure out how we really want to be giving feedback, and then come back and definitely revisit this particular first instance and come back to talk about the biomass rubric. But I think this is even a bigger learning about how we want to be using these going forward and providing support.
Great. I really appreciate those suggestions. Judy, sound like a good plan? Indra, I see your hand. I know we're at 6:05, but
I want to recognize that. And one thing that I want to say is we were planning on doing a little bit of reflection, really focusing on this idea of power and privilege, specifically focusing on the idea of racial identity. We didn't get to it, and this is not the first time we haven't gotten to the things that we wanted to do in this subcommittee. Most of the time it's my exercise, so I don't know what is happening, anti-Indra bias happening. But one thing that I really do want to invite every subcommittee member to do before our last meeting is really go back to the YouTube video. And Judy, I was watching you speak to the counselors, Anna coming and talking and really reading that letter, and coming back to the space, really reflecting on our own positionality. And what does that mean for the work that we have been trying to do, the things that we have raised before, and what is the role that we can play in order to enable that equity perspective, specifically keeping identities in mind. I think if we can reflect on that, that would be great. And hopefully we'll get to it next time. Again, I'm not sad that we missed it from my perspective as somebody who was going to facilitate, but I think that's something important that we have to really discuss into the future. So
yeah, thank you, Indra. And Anna.
Just to echo that if we're not talking about this, I don't know what we are here for. I see Claire is written. Can we prioritize that reflection at the top of the next agenda? I would love to see the committee fully focused on this very specific set of asks. I don't have any experience in government, so I held back from saying anything because I thought that y'all moved the agenda around and had already talked about it at the beginning of the meeting. I hear that is not what happened. Just to say, these are the voices we say that we are going to listen to and prioritize, and we have very clear statements in front of us, and I would like to get behind them.
Thanks for that, Anna. Okay. Yeah, appreciate all the input, all the feedback, all the reactions, and the effort tonight. 6:07, I think we should change gears, call it a meeting. See you again next time, likely next month in March.
Thank you all.
Good to be with you all.
Thank you.
Have a
Thanks,
good
Judy,
evening.
for joining us tonight. Special shout out for Judy. It was really great to have you here with us again. Thank you.
Thank you. It was nice to be here.
Yeah, for all your
Thanks, Judy.
expertise and everything.
Thank you.
Yeah. That's $6.50 an hour.
I think it's 6:25, even worse.
It's 6:25.
All right. For that reason, good night.
Yeah.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Night.